support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, OPEC decided they were not going to sell us any more oil. Okay, and so the price of gasoline quadrupled, if you can imagine that, in a very short period of time. All of a sudden, gas became very expensive, if you can get it at all. There were lines of cars lined up all the way around the block to get gasoline. And you might finally get there only to find that they're all out. So that's part of this sort of retrenchment that Americans have to rethink their sort of, compared to the rest of the world, this sort of, luxurious lifestyle, bigger cars, bigger houses, things like that now become into question. Go ahead, Mikey.
So what were the countries that were in OPEC? Was it just countries or was it also like companies? Because from what I understood, it was like these like actual developing countries, but also companies in some other countries that all kind of banded together and work together?
Countries, like the countries that have oil in the Middle East, I believe without exception are all state controlled, right? How does the Saudi Arabian family live in great wealth? From the oil money, right?
Yeah.
So it's controlled by the state, which is controlled by the king in that case, right? So it's states, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Mikey, right? OPEC, countries, not firms. So it's really countries that decided not going to sell oil to the United States, and this led to this crisis that we had. The price of fuel skyrockets, and Americans have to adjust to it. Also, as you said, well, kind of leave that for the next question. I don't want to get too much into the economy. Another part of the era of limits is in our ability to influence events around the world. With the failure of Vietnam, Americans feel that, we can't just put our power, whether it's our military or our diplomacy, we can't just make the world the way we want it. We have to accept that we cannot influence events the way we used to. And so there becomes this, maybe we're not going to be the world power going forward. Maybe we'll lose the Cold War. America starts questioning its confidence, or has a crisis of confidence.
So where else would America get their oil from if not? Because I know that that's where most of the oil is controlled, and I know that we have some oil here, especially in that's also disputed in Alaska and other places.
Right.
So how do we today at least
to make up for that?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I know
Michael wants to get in there.
Yes, the United States, I'm pretty sure, is the one of the biggest. It's funny, one of the biggest producers of oil, but we're one of the only countries that uses so much more oil than we produce, so we have to import it. So there is no oil embargo against the United States on OPEC. Right. So we do get a lot of oil from the Middle East, and that's kind of why, in a lot of ways, for example, I know this has come up a lot with 9/11. Is that a big part of it is that Saudi Arabia kind of was somewhat involved in 9/11, but they're never going to get called out for it because Saudi Arabia sells a lot of oil to the United States. So
we're relying on some territories that aren't. It's like if we were to get all our oil from Russia, it's like.
Yeah. That's why you have Donald Trump. One of his famous quotes is "drill, baby, drill." It's how the U.S. needs to be energy dependent, so we don't have to rely on these countries who
energy independent.
Yeah, energy independent. So because who knows what these countries obviously we're not getting oil from Iran, but with Saudi Arabia, you never know which way the tides are going to turn, and that was a huge thing with. A lot of European nations get energy from Russia, so obviously when they're going and supporting Ukraine, it causes a lot of tension in the region.
Right, and when you know oil is going to be high, in the long run you can adjust, right? You can develop other technologies, you can realize you got to build smaller cars, but in the short run you can't. So when the price of oil just absolutely skyrockets, you still have to get to work, right? And so people still need to heat their homes, so that's the problem. Longer term, you can start to look at alternatives, which we end up doing. But in the short term, we were really dependent on this oil, so that was a big change. And the Vietnam hangover, as they call it, is also part of what's going on now. Is that we feel that it's the first time we really lost the war, right? We lose the Vietnam War. Vietnam becomes all communist, and all of our men and money put toward that, we come up empty. And so now the thinking is that we should not get involved around the world, and we should maybe think more about isolationism and maybe not using our power projected around the world. All of that is this sort of retrenchment in the 70s, this sort of era that we're saying we have to rein in our appetite, so to speak. All right, number 3, let's get more specific into the economic changes during the period. Mikey mentioned it a little bit. We'll go a little deeper. Question 3, Mike.
So during this period, the U.S. Economy faced significant challenges marked by what's called a stagflation, which is a combination of high inflation and stagnant growth. So we have is prices are rising and the economy is not really growing at all. So a lot of this was triggered, like we've been talking about, by the 1973 oil crisis, which led to soaring energy prices and reduced consumer purchasing power. So obviously oil prices are going up and people can't buy the oil that they need. As global competition increased, particularly from Europe and Japan, American manufacturing declined and economic growth slowed. So we see kind of like, for example, car companies, a lot of them are moving factories abroad. We see, or not necessarily yet, but we see a lot of competition.
Right, that's a little bit later on, I would say.
Yeah, but we see a lot of competition growing abroad. And so now we have a decrease in American manufacturing. The Ford and Carter administration, so obviously they struggled really to address these issues. So like we spoke about, Carter focused on energy conservation and deregulation, and Ford attempted to combat it with wage and price controls. But both faced rising unemployment and persistent inflation. So both administrations, Ford and Carter, were really unable to deal with the economic kind of lack of economic growth and stagflation that was going on.
Right, as you said, yeah, go ahead, finish up.
Oh, sorry.
Good?
By the end of the decade, the country was grappling with a sense of economic insecurity, and it's a transition, obviously, to this era of limits. So now we see, obviously, a transition in the 1980s, kind of going ahead, but then we have Reagan's focus on tax cuts, deregulation, and free market policies.
Right, we'll get to that a little bit down the road. A term comes into play called the Rust Belt. In the Northeast, in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, where a lot of the manufacturing goes on. The car companies, you know, they're all centered around Detroit. And now those factories are closing. That's what they mean by the Rust Belt, an area where manufacturing has died, companies have been closed, and the factories are just rusting over.
Yeah, so I actually went to the Ford F-150, I used to call it a plant. Or
They call it a plant, right?
Right outside of Detroit, and it was really interesting. Like we like were able to walk through and see like all the workers doing various things, and then you see the cars being test driven on a little track, and they have a whole like Ford gift shop, and it's all right outside of Detroit. It was really
This
cool.
was on your cross-country trip?
Yeah,
at that time?
2 years ago. So
Wow.
it was really cool.
So you saw the assembly line?
Yeah, and it was only for the F-150,
Right.
like the pickup truck, but
Right.
yeah, it was like this huge plant, and yeah, it was just definitely a cool experience.
Right, so because the price of oil, so oil is what we call an intermediate good, right? Like we don't buy oil, we buy gasoline, which is made from oil, but it has to be refined. But oil is used in just about every manufacturing process. Anything that's made is usually oil is involved. So when the price of oil goes up, it's not just people can't afford to buy gas for their cars. Companies have to spend more to run their plants, and so their costs go up. And so that's what's happening here. You mentioned the term stagflation, right? That's a clever combination of stagnation and inflation. Putting together, you get stagflation. This is something we study in economics. We were just talking about that today. Right now, there could be some signs of stagflation on the horizon. Again, that's when prices go up. At the same time, unemployment goes up. Usually those two things go in opposite of each other. Prices get high, unemployment goes down, not up. But here both were going up at the same time, which kind of flummoxed economists because we don't have a tool to fix that. That's a worst case scenario when both of those variables, prices and the unemployment rate, are both going up. In fact, when you add those two together, They call that the misery index. Unemployment plus inflation. Inflation in those days was double digits. So was unemployment. Compared to today, where inflation's a little over 3% and unemployment is a little over 4%, that's not bad. A misery index of 7 and change. But a misery index over 20 in the 70s was really a time where the economy was in trouble. It was the last time until the last year or two where we experienced huge inflation. The inflation was caused by spending for the war in Vietnam at the same time when companies have to spend more to make their product. What do companies do when they have to spend more to make the product?
You're going to raise prices on consumers.
They have to raise the price on the final product, and that makes more expensive. So those things were happening with inflation. You mentioned price and wage controls. President Ford tried that. That's when the government, by law, tells companies you cannot raise your prices, and tells companies you cannot raise your wages. You got to keep them steady, but that policy has failed and always fails, because all it does is, it's like putting a pot on a boiling pot of water, or putting a cover. You put a cover on it, you don't see the water, but when you lift the cover, it all goes up. And so that was something that, if anything, made the situation worse.
So I was talking to my to my dad about this the
I
other
love when
day.
you guys talk to your parents about what's going on in class.
Yeah, we were talking about like specifically the steel tariffs that are like being like proposed and talked about.
Yeah.
Because what I didn't understand was like why, if we're like applying these tariffs on Chinese steel,
Right.
Then that would increase the amount of American steel being purchased from like Americans buying from other Americans.
Right, because the American steel now would be cheaper.
Yeah, but so, and then my dad told me that the American manufacturers would then increase their prices because they can. So why can't that be, like, because I know like it doesn't, if I'm an American steel manufacturer, wouldn't I be more inclined to leaving the price where it is, so that way people don't like, because if I start increasing the
Right.
prices, people who are buying like cars will start complaining and say like the prices are too much, and then
Right.
they'll just take down the tariffs. So like it's
Okay,
a lose-lose situation.
Good question there. So if I raise my prices, but I'm still below the foreign price, right? I'm still below the foreign price. Let's say you got Japanese car and American car, $20,000 each. Now we'll put a 10% tariff on the Japanese car, so now it's going to cost $22,000. The American car company can raise theirs to $21,000 and still be better. So you're looking to buy a car, you're not happy that the price went up, but it's still better than the foreign car. And so you can still keep your sales if you don't raise it too much. So you're saying if the government tells them you can't raise it, right?
Or you can't raise it too much, because like I feel like at some point like they're raising it to like, yeah, because I think even they don't have to necessarily match the price, but if it's raising it by a lot, then it's still going to cause.
Well, you could even
outrage.
argue, if we go back to the New Deal, when the Supreme Court told Roosevelt, you can't control prices. Remember the Schechter case, right?
Yeah.
So that would probably be unconstitutional. Presidents don't have the power to tell a company, you gotta cut your prices, right? They don't have that power to do that, according to the Supreme Court. So they probably wouldn't even have power to do it. If it was a true national emergency, maybe then they'd have the power to do it. Like during war, the president says to these companies, look, you can't raise your prices, we need
Yeah,
the
we need
war.
this. Yeah.
We need the war material.
But what about like in the case of a monopoly, where it seems like this one company is getting all the control of American steel, and then like they can just raise their prices as much as they want because
Right.
there's no competition.
Also, if you don't let the domestic company raise their prices, then they can't give their workers a raise.
Yeah.
And the whole point of the tariff is to help the American
American
workers,
workers.
right? So you want companies to charge more and therefore pay their workers more, right? Because the workers will benefit. And if the government says you can't raise your prices, then it's kind of like, well, why'd you put the tariff on in the first place? Because that's the whole point of it, is to help us, right? So that's kind of the thing. So that's why the US consumer usually has to pay more for every product when you put a tariff on.
But then the U.S. worker, like the working American citizen, is getting paid more, while the average person who isn't a worker is paying more, like for goods.
At least in the longer run. You're
Yeah.
not gonna like give workers a raise the minute you raise your prices.
Yeah.
But down the road, the workers will demand higher wages when they see the companies making more money.
Exactly.
Then the union will come to them and say, look, you guys had a killer year. You guys made billions this year. Our workers deserve some of that. And they'll
Yeah.
put pressure on to raise the wages. So that will come longer term. Okay, so the economy is in trouble in the 70s. The Rust Belt, or the term is deindustrialization. Deindustrialization. The fact that we're making less things in our factories and we don't need import the rest. We talk about foreign competition, right? You know, the Japanese car, right? They're very popular. You got a foreign company, the Japanese car, and the Honda first came off the cars were so small and so Americans laughed that buying a Japanese car would be seen as low quality. Now American car companies have new competition. But in the 60s into the early 70s, American car companies didn't have much was that unions got too powerful and workers' jobs are too comfortable and they don't have to worry. Not gonna get fired. They can't fire them before.
moving overseas, which left these early workers unemployed. And then this quick economic downturn resulted in declining tax revenues, which caused the cities to struggle with maintaining public services such as sanitation, education, and law enforcement.
Okay, so let's make sure we
Poverty and urban decay. And then the oil crisis of the 70s.
Juxtaposition in one video is this.
Talk about excessive drugs.
There he is.
Is it Jones' house?
It's like 6983 101 Street.
Now, he's met with resistance because people living there feel that Republicans, they don't care about us. They're only for the rich people. They only care about white people. What is this guy doing here? So he's going right into a place where he's not liked to try to say, Democrats had power, they didn't fix it, why don't you give me a chance?
I should get shot.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
Mr. Trooper,
Yeah.
when you said Carter did this, did you mean Reagan or did they both do it?
No, they both did it. I looked for video of Carter, couldn't find anything. They both did it. And Carter was a Southerner, so also kind of out of place
Yeah.
in a New York City.
Where was Reagan from?
Reagan's from California.
How did he not get shot?
Yeah. Is that fireworks or gunshots? I can't even tell.
And we're going to get to that. The cities enjoy a renaissance into the 90s. And now the South Bronx is expensive to live in.
Yeah.
It's gentrified.
Oh, right.
Charlotte Street to look at all of this, and then they said that this was going to be a symbol of what the government had done with their lives. That was on October 5th, 1977. I put together some of the history of that promise. Then about 6 weeks later, Jack Watson of the White House came back on a 2-day fact-finding trip. Newly elected Mayor Koch had a meeting
Talking
with
about the Democrats who have
Oh,
the
Ed
power.
Koch, that's the Queensboro Bridge.
Yeah. He was the mayor at the
going to be
time.
an immediate
Mr.
grant
Cumberland was by
for 1,000 units of Section 8 subsidized housing, but it was the beginning of $1.5 billion
There's a
They need
union.
27,650 units of subsidized housing, 10,000 new jobs over a 7-year period, a job corps center, a hub transit way, youth programs, business loans, parks, and et cetera.
So he's saying all that money was promised to make this place better. Subsidized housing, meaning the government's gonna kick in money so that people can afford to pay their rent. He's going through the long list of promises. So this is an era where the great society of the 60s and 70s, the idea that all it takes is money to fix social problems, he's now refuting that. He's saying all these promises were made to fix this, and it's worse than ever. So that's what he's saying there. We don't have time to watch the whole thing, but if you Google it later, you'll see he gets into an exchange with a woman on the sidewalk, and she's yelling at him, and he gets frustrated, he gets flustered, and he says, "Oh, I'm trying to help you," blah blah. He says, "Get that gummit." Yeah. All right, let's try to get another question in here if we could. Question or two. Corey, I'll leave that on there for you in case you want to.
Oh yeah, bow down. Maybe bow down to it.
Exactly.
Very good, very good.
All right, so let's now go to the Watergate scandal. Shay had that one?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll cover that one.
What?
I've covered questions before.
She has a little attitude.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said Shear had that. I heard Shear. Oh, I would never do
Tomato,
that.
tomato.
Oh, all right, we got 10 minutes. Is that enough?
Yeah.
All right, take us through slowly.
Okay. Watergate.
Watergate.
It was a career-ending scandal for Richard Nixon.
Okay, he ended up resigning, right?
Okay, so early on, a few men called burglars, that's what they were referred to, they were spotted trying to get into the Democratic National
Headquarters.
Yes, Congress or whatever. And it was a key event of the Democratic Party. We all know because we're all like, it's more apparent now. But anyways, Nixon was not a member of the Democratic Party. That's important to know. But Nixon himself, when he was pressed by the press.
Well, hold on a second. I think when you Democrat. He's, as you say, looking for political advantage. The world learned about this mysterious
So this is just more of a chronology question. So why did you go?
actions behind creep and expose Nixon for his scandals.
What burglars do you know that have ties to the CIA?
It's just a crime, yeah.
Well, you know, those guys understand. A whole bunch of different people went to jail over this. So, I think how really honestly makes Watergate look like a joke. The difference is his fellow Republicans are sticking with him. And so there's no impeachment because Republicans have a majority and they're not trying to impeach President Trump. And so then we ask, well, what's the remedy for a president abusing his power if you're not going to do impeachment? And that's where we are right now today in terms of what would be the check on a president who abuses power. The constitutional check is impeachment. If that doesn't happen, the constitutional check is courts ordering him to stop what he's doing. What if he ignores the courts? Then we're in uncharted territory about what is the next step. It's what we call a constitutional crisis, meaning that the Constitution doesn't have the answer for what's happening. And we're going to see how it plays out in the next couple of weeks and months. Yeah.
Was Ford his vice president?
Yes.
Okay.
He was his vice president.
But that means he was still like aligned with him politically.
Yeah.
Somewhat. Also part of this story, which, you know, falls by the wayside because there are so many things happening here. Years earlier, Nixon's vice president, who wasn't Ford, resigns, because he also was embroiled in just your garden variety typical corruption scandal. It came out that when he was governor of Maryland, his name was Agnew. He had taken bribes. So when that came out, he resigned, and he picked Ford to be his vice president, and then Ford pardoned Nixon. When Nixon resigned, Ford pardoned him so that the government couldn't prosecute Nixon and throw him in jail. And Ford said that it's better to move on as a nation. As he says, our long national nightmare is over. That the Constitution worked. In that situation, the evidence of Nixon's being involved was on a secret tape recording device that Nixon himself kept in the Oval Office. He recorded every conversation. He did it to protect himself. He thought, well, I want to have the truth in case anybody's going to accuse me of doing something, we're going to have the truth. One of his aides was testifying that there was a hidden recording device in the Oval Office. The judge said, all right, I want to hear what's on that tape. Nixon said, well, I'm not giving you that tape. Why? Executive privilege. That tape belongs to me, and you don't have a right to hear it. The court demanded, you gotta go?
With all respect,
You'll have to-
but finish your sentence.
Okay.
of course.
So in that case, he complied with the court order and handed over the tapes. It was a mysterious 18-minute
Oh.
blank period.
No.
So